Good morning everybody. Welcome back to my video. I am Anusha of CSC department working as assistant professor in Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. In my videos I am discussing about the subject programming with objects which is based on Java. So in our previous video we have discussed about how interface can be used in inheritance that is extending of interfaces and how multiple inheritance is achieved in Java using interfaces. Now in today's video we will be dealing about exception handling, what are the types of exceptions and what is the use of try and catch. So what is an exception? Let's look into an example. Let's say we are dividing a number by, let's say we are implementing a division of some numbers, right? So in that case, whenever we get the denominator as 0, this division is not defined. So this is an example of, it will create an error. It will create a runtime error. So such runtime errors are called as exceptions. Now another example is that, let's say we have an array of size 5 and we are trying to access the 6th or 7th element of it, or let's say we are trying to access the 8th element. So what happens? The array of size 5 will be from 0 to 4. Now when we try to access any element after the 4th element, it is again leading to an error. So that case also, it is also an example of runtime error. So exceptions are those events which will interrupt the flow of the program. It will interrupt the normal flow of the program. So these all are some abnormal conditions which arises in the code during runtime. So it is the shorthand of the phrase exceptional event. So all such cases, when you try to access a class which does not exist, or when you try to access a file which does not exist, these are all runtime error, or it may be some logical error in the program. So all these things will lead to runtime error. So what happens while you execute that program, when the compiler encounters such type of error, it will stop the execution and it will give you some error messages. So whenever such error occurs, what happens? The compiler, the runtime will create an object of exception type. It will create an object and it will hand it over to the runtime system. So this exception object will carry all the details about the type of the exception being thrown, like whether it is an arithmetic exception or whether it is an array out of bound exception. So that determines the type and the state of the program. So at which point, at which line that error has been occurred, what caused the error, all these things will be defined by inside the exception object. So whenever any such exceptional events occur, the runtime will create an object of it and it will be thrown. So creating an exception object and handing it to the runtime is called as throwing an exception. So whenever an exception is thrown, an exception is encountered, it will stop the execution of that particular program. So we don't get a continuity of execution of the program. So this is one of the major issue faced when you get such type of errors. So to handle them, so that we can have a smooth flow of events or smooth flow of execution, Java has introduced the exception handling mechanisms. So these exception handling mechanisms is supported by the keywords, by 5 keywords, which are try, catch, throw, throws and finally. So these are the 5 keywords which is used for exception handling. Now if you want any set of codes which has to be checked for some exception, if we want, then that set of statements will be placed inside the try block. So if we want to monitor monitor some set of statements for any runtime exceptions may occur, then such type of statements will be placed inside the try block. And whenever any statement inside the exception creates an exception, then the exception object is being thrown. That exception object thrown should be caught by the catch block after it. So we always have a try block followed by a catch block. So all the statements which is present inside the try block will be monitored for exceptions. And whenever any exception occur, whenever any statements throw any exception, that exception will be caught by the catch block and they will be handled. So let's say if we have division by 0, when the denominator is coming to 0, we can put a message saying that the denominator is 0, you have to give a non-zero denominator. Some messages like that can be kept inside the catch block. Then the throws keyword is used to declare any exception in any particular block. So if the programmer knows that there are chances of that set of code to throw this type of some XYZ exception, then that can be declared using the throws keyword. So this throws keyword can be used along with the method or any classes. So while declaring a class, while creating a class, you can say that this class A throws so and so exception. Like that we can define, so that we are telling it in advance. We are informing the occurrence of an exception so that we can provide a exception handling mechanism for that. So that is the use of throw keyword, which is used to declare an exception. We make use of the throw keyword to manually throw an exception. If you want to throw an exception manually, if the programmer himself wants to throw an exception, then we make use of the throw keyword. And if we have any set of statements that has to be compulsorily executed, those set of statements will be placed inside the finally block. So these are the 5 keywords which is used for exception handling. So let's look into how this exception occur. So let's say we have the main block, we have the main method. From the main method, we are calling some method. We are calling the method. This method is not having any exception handling. There is no exception handling present inside. Sorry, let's say this is having the exception handling. Now this method is calling another method, say meth1. Okay, so we are having the main. From the main, a method with exception handler is called. So from the method meth is called from main, which is having an exception handling. Then from this method, another method named meth1 is called. So let's say this method does not have any exception handling mechanisms. So if that method does not have any exception handling, and inside that statement, some error occurred. So we have the set of statements inside meth1. So let's say at line number 2, some error occurred. So at this point, the exception object will be thrown. So what will happen? The runtime will check whether there is any handling mechanisms present inside these. The handling mechanisms present inside these inside this method meth1. So it will check for whenever the error occur, whenever the exception is thrown, whenever an exception is created, it throws the exception, and that method will look for the appropriate handler. It will check inside the meth1 whether there is any exception handler. So if in case it doesn't have any exception handling, it will forward that exception object to its next higher level. So from here, since this method don't have any exception handling, that exception object will be sent over to the higher level of. So at this point again, it will check whether there is any method handling. exception handling. So it at this point also, at this point it is having some, let's say at this point it is having some exception handling. So at this point, when if this here it is a 3-level method handling, but I have given only 2 levels. So at this point it found that there is some exception handler. So when it finds that exception handler catches those exception and will provide, it may be using the try catch block or using the try catch block. Then some handling mechanisms can be given inside the catch block. So so from this point onwards, the execution can continue. So wherever that exception has occurred, so whatever statements is present after the point of occurrence of exception, those statements will not be executed. And once that exception is being handled by some method, then after that it can continue the execution. Now let's look into different types of exceptions. All the exceptions in Java are present inside the throwable class. They are all inside the throwable class, which is inside the lang package of Java. So all the exceptions comes under the throwable class, and all the exceptions can be divided into 2 types, which is exception. It can be divided into 2 types, which can be either checked or unchecked exceptions. So they can be either checked or unchecked exception. The checked exceptions are those exceptions which are created which are checked at the time of compilation, and whereas unchecked exceptions are checked during the runtime. So so all the exceptions which directly inherit the exception class are the ones which is checked exception, except for runtime exception. So under the unchecked exceptions, we have the error as well as the runtime exceptions, and all the other exceptions which directly inherit the exception class, exception class, they are of they are of checked exception. So basically we can say that there are the different type of exceptions are checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions. So the checked exceptions are checked at the compile time, and unchecked exceptions are not checked they are not checked, but they are checked during runtime. And under these unchecked exceptions, we have these error and the runtime exceptions. We look into the detail in the coming part. So let's look into checked exception. As I have told you, these checked exceptions are the ones which are checked at compile time. They are checked at compile time, and they all inherit the throwable class. These exceptions which come under checked exceptions are directly inherit the throwable class. So as we have seen in the image, the runtime exception also comes under the exception class, but the runtime exception does not are not of check type. Okay. So these exceptions, all these checked exceptions should be either handled using the try catch block, or it should be declared using the throws keyword. So, and if you don't perform these things, then the compiler may throw an error. Compile time error will be displayed. So any checked exception should be handled using the try catch block or using the throws keyword. So an example is file not found exception, where when we are trying to access a file which does not exist, if we try to access a file which is not existing, then that program may throw a file not found exception. This file not found exception. Now similarly, this SQL exception, IO exception, class not found exceptions, these are all examples of checked exceptions. We will be looking some more exceptions. These are all again built-in exceptions of Java. Okay. Next is the runtime exception. So in the these runtime exceptions are those which will inherit the runtime exception. classes which will inherit the runtime exception. For example, the arithmetic exception, array index out of bound exception, all these comes under runtime exception, and these exceptions are checked during the runtime. They are checked at runtime. And they are mainly created because of the bugs which is present in the program, like when here this array index out of bound exception occur when we try to access let's say when we try to access an element which is out of bound of the array. Let's say we have an array of 5 elements and we are trying to access the 6th element. Then this throws the array index out of bound exception. So this is a bug in the program. Okay. And these unchecked exceptions need not be declared using the throws clause. Next is the error, which is again under the it comes under the throwable class. But these kinds of errors are generally, exceptional conditions are generally created because of the hardware or software malfunction. So these type of error, we generally don't handle them because they are out of reach, like they are creating some serious issues and they are some abnormal conditions. So these exceptions are we are not handling such type of errors using the try-catch blocks. So they are all abnormal conditions. So when, say for example, when you try to access a file, you are unable to open the file because of the system malfunction. So then such cases leads to errors, and these type of errors the system may not be able to recover from. They cannot recover from such type of errors. Now let's look into an example of generation of an uncaught exception. So in our case, let's say we have a class named exe0. Inside that we have a subroutine. Subroutine means a method named as subroutine, and inside the main method we are calling that subroutine method. Okay. Now what is happening inside the subroutine method? We have a value initialized to 0 and you are dividing 10 by that variable. So here it is like 10 by 0. So this operation is not defined in maths itself. So this operation is not defined in Java also. So this is what this will create an exception. This is creating an runtime exception. So when this statement is encountered by the compiler will create a exception object. So it will so this whole thing will come under that exception object. So it will say that the exception type is division by 0. The exception type is arithmetic exception and it is caused by the division by 0 and at which line it has occurred. It has occurred at line number 9 in the line number 9 of this class. Okay, and in turn, so this at line number 9 this is the line number 9. So this is the line of a subroutine, which this subroutine was called by main at line number 21. So at line number 21 this statement was called, right? So what happens at this point? The exception had occurred. So when exception occur at this point, the program will stop its execution. So it will throw that exception object and the execution will be stopped. So whatever statement, so this in turn will lead to this point, right? So because subroutine was called inside the main. So at this point again, the execution will be stopped and whatever statement follows this line will be stopped, will not be executed. So that is one of the main issues which arrives. So to solve this problem, they have gone for the exception handling techniques. So this is this is the problem with unhandled exceptions. Okay, so what are the advantages of handling an exception? So if you handle an exception using any of those handling mechanisms in Java, it will allow you to fix that error. Then it will prevent the program from automatically terminating. It will prevent the propagation of errors, and you can always provide a meaningful error reporting for any exception occurred. So these are the advantages of handling an exception for handling an execution. Handling an exception. Now, so one of the important mechanism for handling exception is the use of try-catch block. So you have the try block. We'll have the set of statements inside that and the catch block. So whatever code which we want to check for, or the code which we want to monitor for exception handling will be placed inside the try block. So the code which will be enclosed inside the try block will be monitored for any exception. So if at all any exception has been thrown by this statements, it will create an exception object and it will be thrown. So when that exception object is thrown, that exception object will be caught by the catch block. It will be caught by the catch block, and here inside the catch block you can fix the error, or you can give some messages saying the cause of the error, or you can handle the exception. You can provide a fixing of that exception inside the try block. So the catch block will always follow the try block. So this is the basic general or basic form of the try-catch block. You will have the try block for the block of code for monitoring the error. Then you have you can have multiple catches. It allows the use of multiple catches inside that. And then you will have the finally block. So inside the finally block, the code inside the finally block will be always executed So of this catch block and finally block, so any try block should either have a catch block or a finally block. Now let's look into an example of usage of try catch. We have a class named exception, and inside the main method we have a try block. So we have some variables d, a, and n is initialized to 0. These are all integer variables. Then we have the try block. Inside that we are initializing d to 0, and we are performing 42 by d. So d is 0. At this point, an exception will be thrown. So since these set of statements is present inside the exception block, inside the try block, the exception object thrown here will be caught by this catch block. So when this exception object is thrown, whatever statements follow this line will not be executed. So, and inside the catch block, we have this catch block is catching the exception object which is thrown at that point. At this point, it is caught into the exception object E, and then we are giving some mechanisms for handling. So it is displaying with what is the exception, and it is so we are giving an error message to enter a non-zero denominator. And then we have the body of the program continuing. So let's see what happens here. Now at this point, an exception object is thrown. So it is caused by division by 0, right? So that exception object is caught into this object. So it is this division by 0 comes under the arithmetic exception. It comes under the arithmetic exception. So you can either have arithmetic exception or simply the exception class. Okay. So here since we know it, we just gave it as arithmetic exception E. Now, so here we are displaying the exception E. that exception object. So when that so what will this exception object contain? It will contain the type and the details of it, right? So the type of the arithmetic exception is the type of exception object is arithmetic exception, and its name is division by 0. So how to handle it? We have to give a non-zero denominator, so that error message is all being displayed. Is also being displayed. And since we have handled this exception, there won't be any interruption for the flow of the program. So because of which we get the statements. This is at this point the try catch block ends. So whatever, since we have handled that exception perfectly, there is no interruption of the program. So whatever statements follows the catch block also will be executed. So whatever statement will come, so here we have to display after try catch statement. So that statement also will come inside will be shown as will be displayed. So I have used the textbook Complete Reference by Herbert Schill to prepare these slides, and I have referred the Java tutorial by Oracle as well as the website Java T Point to prepare these slides. So in today's class, we have dealt about exception handling, what are checked and unchecked exceptions, the different types of exception, and how we can make use of the try and catch keywords in exception handling. So that's all for today's video. Thank you so much.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.